The cold, sterile air of the Galactic Tribunal chamber pressed in around General Elira Varos like a vice. The vaulted ceiling loomed high above her, its black marble surface etched with the insignia of the Empire, an ever-present reminder of its unyielding authority. Rows of alien dignitaries, military officers, and bureaucrats lined the amphitheater, their varied expressions ranging from disdain to intrigue. Elira stood alone at the center of it all, flanked by two towering Imperial guards in obsidian armor. They had taken her weapons, her rank insignia, and even the battered dog tags she had worn since the first Terran-Zenth conflict. Yet they had not taken her resolve. High Chancellor Varric, a gaunt, silver-skinned Authari with piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward from the elevated dais, unfurling a long scroll of translucent datasheets. His voice rang out, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. Elira Varos, Supreme Commander of the Terran Defense Forces. You stand accused of crimes against sentient life, violations of the Galactic Accords, and acts of brutality so severe they shake the very foundation of civilized warfare. A murmur rippled through the assembled spectators. The words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. Elira met Varric's gaze without flinching. These charges, Varric continued, detail the genocide of Zenth Prime's civilian population, the use of biological warfare, the destruction of entire planetary ecosystems, and the ruthless extermination of prisoners of war. He turned his gaze to the council. These are not merely violations of military conduct. They are atrocities. Silence followed. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Elira took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice even, but laced with steel. Before I respond, I have one question. She let her eyes drift across the assembly, her presence commanding even in shackles. Do you truly understand what a war crime is? The question caused a stir. Some shifted in their seats. Others narrowed their eyes. Varric frowned. This is no game, human. The charges are clear. And yet, Elira said, tilting her head slightly, it seems convenient that the Galactic Tribunal only finds its voice when it is humanity being judged. A rustling of fabric, the soft clicking of mandibles from an insectoid council member. Elira continued, the war with the Zenth Dominion did not begin with us. They struck first, raiding Terran colonies, enslaving or butchering millions. They saw us as cattle, lesser beings. And when we fought back, we fought to survive. Survival does not justify genocide, Varric said coldly. Elira exhaled through her nose. Then define it. The Chancellor blinked. She pressed on. Define genocide. Define a war crime. Define it in terms that do not condemn half the powers represented in this room. An uneasy silence settled. Elira stepped forward, her voice low but charged with emotion. I led a war against an empire that sought to wipe us out. The strategies I used were ruthless because they had to be. But let's be clear, humanity has never believed in meaningless slaughter. Every action I took had a purpose. A voice from the tribunal, a reptilian Ketheri delegate, hissed, you unleashed plagues upon their homeworld. I turned their own bioweapons against them, Elira corrected. Weapons they had already tested on our people. Another alien spoke, a Mixian with translucent skin and many-limbed grace. You targeted their war councils with surgical strikes. Elira nodded. Yes, while they bombed entire cities, we eliminated only the leadership directing those attacks. Tell me, does it become a crime when the victims are on your side of the war? A flicker of discomfort spread across the council. Varric's mouth thinned. You make clever arguments, General, but the evidence remains. He gestured, and a holographic projection shimmered into existence. A ravaged world, charred and lifeless. Zenth Prime, he declared. Once a thriving world, now reduced to ash. Elira's eyes darkened. You blame me for this? The destruction of the planet was the result of your campaign. No, Elira's voice was sharp, unwavering. It was the result of the Zenth refusing to surrender even when it was clear they had lost. They burned their own world rather than let it fall into human hands. A murmur swept through the crowd. Some had heard whispers of this before, but never confirmed. Alira's hands clenched behind her back. We gave them a chance to surrender. They refused. They activated their own planetary self-destruction protocols. And now you stand here, painting me as the villain, because it is easier than admitting the truth. Humanity was never the monster you wanted us to be. The silence that followed was deafening. Varric's expression remained unreadable, but his grip on the datasheet tightened. Even if that were true, your methods were necessary, Alira interrupted. We do not apologize for surviving. For the first time, doubt flickered in Varric's eyes. He turned to the tribunal. The council will deliberate. Alira smirked faintly, a dangerous glint in her eyes. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. The cold wind of Zenth Prime howled through the shattered remains of the once thriving capital city. Fire still smoldered in the wreckage, sending plumes of black smoke into a sky choked with the remains of a dying empire. General Alira Varos stood on the edge of a collapsed structure, watching as her troops moved with precise efficiency, securing what little remained of the battlefield. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and something worse. Something deeper, the unmistakable stench of war. Her comlink crackled. General, forward teams report minimal resistance. The remaining Zenth forces are scattered, disorganized. Alira pressed a finger to her earpiece. Survivors. A brief pause. Pockets of them, mostly civilians. Some soldiers, but they're surrendering without a fight. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing only slightly. The battle had been won, but its cost was etched into the bones of the planet. A victory, but not a triumph. A sound behind her made her turn. Colonel Doran Kane, her second in command, approached with a measured stride, his rifle slung across his back. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his sharp eyes still held a glint of calculation. We did what we had to, he said, reading the storm of thoughts on her face. Alira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gestured toward the horizon, where the remnants of the Zenth war machine lay in twisted ruin. I wonder if they ever thought this would happen, that we would be the ones standing here, looking down at their broken empire. Kane snorted. Doubt it. They believed we were insects to be crushed underfoot. He kicked a piece of shattered armor. Guess they learned otherwise. She looked at him then, studying the lines of weariness on his face. And what did we learn, Doran? His expression darkened. That mercy is a luxury humanity can't afford. Alira turned back to the battlefield, letting his words settle. She had seen firsthand what mercy had cost them in the early days of the war. The first colonies they had lost to the Zenth, the captured civilians who had never been returned. The peace envoys who had been slaughtered in their own diplomatic chambers. The memories twisted inside her like a blade. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Lieutenant Sailvas, their intelligence officer, arrived with a data slate in hand, his face grim. We intercepted their last transmissions before their command structure collapsed, he said. You'll want to hear this. He tapped a control, and a guttural voice, harsh, alien, yet thick with desperation, filled the air. To all remaining forces, do not let them take what is ours. If defeat is inevitable, deny them everything. A second voice, sharper, more rigid with command, cut in. Initiate Scorched Earth Protocol. Zenth Prime belongs to no one. The recording ended in static. Alira's hands curled into fists. They did this, she said, voice quiet but seething. They burned their own world rather than surrender. Kane exhaled through his nose. And now they want to call us the war criminals. Voss hesitated. There's more. Before the transmission cut off, we traced part of the signal's origin. It wasn't just from a military command bunker. He turned the slate toward her, displaying a series of coordinates. They broadcasted from their civilian shelters, too. Alira's stomach turned. They made sure their own people heard their last order, Voss continued, his voice tight with disgust. They wanted them to believe death was better than surrender. Alira inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain composed. What's the current civilian count? Unknown, Voss admitted. Many fled underground. Some may have survived the detonations, but it's hard to say. She pressed a hand to her forehead, weighing their options. The world beneath them was dead, but there were still lives clinging to its remains. They had won the battle, but what came next would determine whether they had won anything at all. "Send out search teams," she ordered. "Prioritize non-combatants. If there are survivors, we bring them in." Kane frowned. "You think they'll come willingly?" "No," she admitted. "But we give them the choice." For a long moment, Kane said nothing. Then finally he nodded. Hours passed as the search teams combed through the ruins, finding survivors where they could. Some resisted, spitting curses in their guttural tongue, clinging to the last embers of defiance. Others, hollow-eyed and gaunt, simply surrendered without a word. Elira watched as a young soldier led a small group of Zenth civilians into the encampment. Among them was a child, barely more than a hatchling, its wide, slit-pupil eyes staring up at her with something between fear and confusion. She crouched down, meeting its gaze. "You're safe now." The child didn't respond, didn't move, but it didn't look away either. As Elira rose, Kane appeared at her side. "The tribunal will never believe any of this," he muttered. "They won't want to," she corrected. "But the truth doesn't need their permission." The wind howled again, carrying the echoes of a war that had not yet finished being fought. Elira stood before the Galactic Tribunal once more, but this time, something had shifted. The weight of the accusations still hung in the air, thick and oppressive, yet she sensed a hesitation among the council members. Doubt, uncertainty, cracks in the mask of absolute judgment they had worn when this trial began. Chancellor Varick's yellow eyes studied her with the same piercing scrutiny as before, but now there was something else in his gaze, an unwillingness to proceed too hastily. The evidence had been presented, the charges had been spoken, and yet, Elira had done more than just defend herself. She had forced them to look at the war beyond the surface-level horrors they wished to condemn. "General Varos," Varick finally said, his voice even careful, "the Council has reviewed additional reports from your campaign against the Zenth Dominion. We have examined testimonies, battlefield recordings, and recovered transmissions from the Zenth command structure." He paused, tapping his elongated fingers against the podium. The entire chamber held its breath. "The facts remain," he continued. "The Zenth homeworld was destroyed, their government annihilated, their war machine dismantled, and yet—" His eyes flickered toward the assembled delegates, gauging their reactions. "The intent behind these actions is now under question." Elira inclined her head slightly, waiting. A new voice rose from the council's ranks, belonging to an Uvethi representative, a species known for their rigid adherence to logic. "We have determined that the Zenth Dominion did indeed enact its own self-destruction protocol rather than accept surrender." The delegates' multifaceted eyes glimmered under the chamber lights. "This is an unusual precedent." Another murmuring wave passed through the crowd. Elira took the moment of uncertainty and stepped forward. "It is not unusual," she said clearly. "It is convenient. Convenient for them to erase their own crimes before you had to confront them. Convenient for them to destroy the evidence that would have forced this tribunal to acknowledge that humanity was never the aggressor." A delegate from the Valari Consortium leaned forward, his gossamer thin tendrils twitching. "Even if this is true, General, your campaign was brutal beyond what was necessary." Elira's jaw tightened. "Necessary according to whom?" She swept her gaze across the chamber. "Do you wish to compare the destruction of Zenth Prime to the massacres of Terran colony worlds? Do you wish to measure the deaths of their civilians against the billions of human lives they consumed as chattel?" Silence. She exhaled, steadying herself. "War is never clean. We did not ask for it. We did not start it. But once it began, we fought to end it. And we ended it in the only way that ensured they would never rise again to do to others what they did to us." Varick's fingers tightened around the edge of his podium. "And yet, you did not wipe them out entirely. Your forces gathered survivors, rescued those who were left behind." Elira held his gaze. Because we are not monsters. Another wave of murmurs. Some skeptical, others contemplative. The mood of the room had changed. The tribunal had begun this trial with the expectation of condemning her. Now they were unsure if they could. Varric leaned forward slightly. If humanity was so merciful, why not seek peace earlier? Alira let out a slow breath. We did. She gestured toward the hollow screens lining the tribunal walls. Pull up the records. The Terran governments sent envoys. They pleaded for negotiations. Every single time, the Zenth response was the same. Surrender or be consumed. The chamber's great screens flickered, and a series of recovered Zenth transmissions played. Their words were harsh, guttural, but the translation was clear. We do not negotiate with prey. Your species exists to be conquered. Humanity will serve or die. A ripple of discomfort moved through the council members. The weight of history pressed against them. They could not ignore this truth. Alira let the silence stretch before she spoke again. You call me a war criminal. You say humanity is dangerous. But what you really fear is that we survived. That we did not break. That we refused to die on our knees. Varric exhaled slowly. This tribunal will reconvene to discuss our final ruling. Alira gave him a sharp, knowing smile. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Alira stood alone in the tribunal's waiting chamber. The weight of the war, the trial, and the endless justifications pressing against her ribs like a slowly tightening vice. Through the narrow viewport, she could see the vastness of space stretching beyond the station. A cold, indifferent witness to the events unfolding within. The door behind her slid open with a hushed hiss. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. They won't condemn you, Kane said, his voice steady but edged with exhaustion. They can't. Alira let out a quiet breath. That doesn't mean they'll admit we were right. Kane stepped beside her, folding his arms as he followed her gaze into the stars. No, but it does mean they'll have to live with the truth. The tribunal was not built for justice. It was built for order. And order demanded that someone bear the weight of war's consequences. For a time, they had tried to place that burden on her, to make humanity the villain they needed. But the evidence had unraveled their certainty, and now the weight was shifting. The door opened again, and this time it was Sailvoss. His expression betrayed little, but the flicker of something in his eyes told her enough. They're ready. Alira pushed off the railing, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off invisible chains. Let's finish this. She stepped into the tribunal hall once more, back straight, gaze unwavering. The assembled council watched her with unreadable expressions, the air thick with unspoken calculations. Chancellor Varric's voice carried across the chamber. General Alira Varos, after extensive review of the evidence, this tribunal finds you. A pause, a measured breath. Not guilty of war crimes. A murmur rippled through the hall. Varric's eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. But let it be known, the destruction of the Zenth Dominion, though justified in the context of war, stands as a reminder of what your species is capable of. Alira tilted her head slightly. Survival. Varric exhaled through his nose. Devastation. She held his gaze a moment longer before offering a thin, knowing smile. Then let the galaxy remember. As she turned and walked away, the whispers of the tribunal followed her. But she paid them no mind. The war was over. The verdict had been given. And humanity had made its message clear.